Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part one of a cultural history of the United States. Now, this is going to be a mini-part series because I want to cover sort of the history and evolution of the values and cultural elements that have shaped the United States and made it into what it is today as a means of understanding the United States and the influence it has in the world. So, not a small brief. And this will probably, like I said, be, give or take, an infinite number of episodes. But hopefully it won't be that long. In any case, this is part one, Cultural History of the United States. And something I want to try with this series, a new experiment, I always like to do experiments, of course, is to have questions. I've been trying to ponder a way to respond more effectively and efficiently to questions that people have about the work I do. And what I've come up with is I'm going to try and do an every other week format. So what I'll do is I'll put up an episode, for instance, this one now, and then I'll collect questions. People can either email me or just put comments below in the video, and then I'll collect those. And then a week later, I will have a friend of mine, Jeremy, will ask me these questions and sort of frame them and help clarify some things that he doesn't understand and sort of play the part of the questioner. And so we'll do a sequence that is questions and answers from the first episode, and then a week later I'll do the second episode, and then we'll do questions from the second episode, and so on. So hopefully this is a way of giving more feedback and sort of providing a richer experience and covering things I missed or correcting mistakes that I make, or just sort of makes a fuller experience, I hope. So, a cultural history of the United States. And this is coming as my first full series from France. And oddly, but I think it makes sense when you think about it, one reason I wanted to move to France was to understand American culture better and how it's influenced and shaped my thinking and how it shapes and affects the world around us. And so I thought, well, moving and being outside of the environment will help clarify some of those elements, because then you can see distinction that you just can't see when you're continually immersed in a single culture. So seriously, one of the motivations for moving was to sort of expand my mind, expand my experiences so that I could understand more fully the culture that has shaped my thinking and my worldview. So this is, for me, a quite important series. And I think without much doubt, we can say that the United States is the most influential country in the world today, and likely the most influential country that has ever existed in the history of the planet. And partly that's just because you couldn't really have global influence much before, basically the British Empire, because of technology, transportation, communications limited that. But today in the world, the U.S. is so dominant in so many ways that it's a commonplace to say, but I think it bears a moment to reflect on as we begin this series. I'm also not saying, however, that this is inevitable or will necessarily go on. This is the sun never sets on the British Empire until, whoa, look at that, sun's going right down there, right? Those, I'm not making that kind of claim. This is not a teleological claim that the U.S. is necessarily going to be this dominant culture for any particular period of time. But today, as it stands, it is, hugely influential in so many ways. So I just want to give a couple of quick numbers. And both today and throughout the series, I'll use a few more numbers than I tend to, because I do want to underpin some of these larger sociological and cultural issues with a framing grounded in pretty good sense of the details. So I apologize if they get overwhelming, but I do think they'll help illustrate the central points that I'm trying to make. In the first episode, the central point I want to make is probably there is no such thing as an American as such, and we'll talk about why that is. And if there is, it's only really begun to come into focus since about 1989. So I know that sounds weird, and I think extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, so hopefully I'll be able to provide that for you. But I really do think it's important to understand, if you're going to understand America and American cultural influence and Americans, there is this central void that we will explore. So first, Americans' influence in the world. Again, this is not a revelation, but I think the details matter. So one, the economy of the U.S. is by far the largest in the world, about $25 trillion a year. China is second, very much smaller, about 2/3 the size, and then it goes way down from there. But the U.S. economy is so large that if California were a country, it would still be in the top 10. In fact, if Texas and New York were countries, all three of those states would be in the top 10 countries in the world, and the United States would still be the largest country. So it'd still be US 1, and then it'd be China, and then California would be tied with Germany, and then I think you get maybe India next, I forget, but then you get Texas and like New York. So, I mean, the sheer size is impressive and overwhelming. But as important as just the scale is about 80-90% of world trade is denominated in dollars. So this means that the valuation is done in dollar or dollar-denominated currencies. And that is just astounding because it just means that the U.S. dollar is the marker for almost all global trade. The only region of the world that is not done this way, Asia is, even though China keeps trying to fight against dollar dominance, Asia is still predominantly done in dollars, Asian trade, is Europe. But there's a big star there. So while in the EU, the euro is used more commonly than the dollar, but not by a lot. But actually it turns out that the EU and the euro are backed by, functionally, by the Federal Reserve. And so both during the 2008 financial crisis and after, and during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve provided hundreds of billions, probably trillions of dollars of support for the ECB, the European Central Bank, key financial institutions, major markets were all supported directly and indirectly by an alphabet soup of facilities that were made available to keep the EU strong and to keep the euro economy going, from collapsing or suffering worse shocks than it was already suffering. And so while in the Eurozone, the euro is more often used than the dollar, it's a closely related currency. One can think of it that way. It is not an entirely independent from the Federal Reserve and dollar denomination, even though in theory it is. So trade is completely dominated. Equities, about 42% of the entire global equities market value is in the U.S. So U.S. has 15% of the world population, but 42% of the global markets. And then you get some of these odd numbers, like the world's largest oil producer is not Saudi Arabia, although they're close. It is the United States. Now, we don't export as much as Saudi Arabia, but still, I mean, we're the largest oil producer in the world. Saudi Arabia is a global power because it exports and produces so much oil. The U.S. produces as much or more oil. We import a lot of oil. We're one of the world's largest importers, and we're a fairly large, not huge, but a fairly large exporter. So we are both the largest producer, one of the largest importers, and a pretty fair-sized exporter, which doesn't really seem to make sense when you think about it, but it just shows that if you want to talk about global energy markets and oil markets, the U.S. is absolutely a central player. We're the largest gas producer in the world. Russia was second. I mean, of course, their economy's gone a bit off the rails, of course, with the invasion of the Ukraine. But Russia built essentially a country, built itself into a world power of sorts, based on its ability to produce gas and oil to a lesser extent. U.S. far exceeds Russia in gas production. Manufacturing, China is number one, U.S. is number two. We're the second largest manufacturing country in the world. We're the largest food exporter in the world by far. So we produce just everything, everything, equities, financial products. So if you think country like Hong Kong or Singapore, where you're like a lot of trade, a lot of financial products, a lot of investment services, Great, they're important hub cities because of this, but they don't have any of the other stuff. Saudi Arabia, Russia, natural resource producers, but they don't have any of this other stuff, right? Eurozone does a little bit of everything, but not remotely on the scale, and they don't produce the oil or the gas, right? And so you go through all of this, and you go, one country is doing all this. Largest food exporter, also largest timber producer and exporter in the world, the United States, and by a fair bit. So even in these base metals, base natural resources. So unsurprisingly, and not really a shock, but the numbers are kind of startling when you look at them. The U.S. is not just a dominant economic power, it's probably the most dominant economic power the world has ever seen. Then you add these cultural elements, not least of which is our culture industry, our movie industry, our music industry, video games, all the computers, technology. Like, where does technology and culture sort of, Instagram, Facebook, these sorts of things. All these cultural industries are coming, not all of them, but a very huge influential portion of global cultural consumption, export, import, is from the United States. Our TV shows are huge. So Japan has this, telenovelas are big, Bollywood, hello, but U.S. is still an incredibly important player in cultural and this sort of soft power side. Of course, there's the dominant power of English as a language all over the world, which is also a cultural export that gives, again, America this heft and this soft power. So that if you're serious about being in the sciences or in global trading markets or want to be like an airline pilot, English is where you want to be, because these are all done in English. Not all, but a huge majority of it is done in English. And so this cultural and soft power dominance is always there, which is not necessary to go along with the economic power of the United States, but boy, it certainly does. And of course, English, we inherited English from the British Empire, so that the already the widespread of English, because of the British, was sort of accelerated and expanded as another English-speaking nation took up that mantle of global sort of activity and dominance. Of course, the military is just silly. Like, if you look at military power, it's the U.S., the U.S., the U.S., and then the U.S. So the United States military spends more money, if you just look at money, than the next 10 largest spenders in the world. So, take the next 10 militaries, the U.S. spends that much or more every year. So just completely outscaled to everybody else in the world. And as much as that is amazing in itself, many of the other top spenders like Germany, Japan, UK, France, and Canada, which are all in the top 10, those are allies of the United States. We share military alliances with them. So the militaries of the UK, France, Canada, Japan, and Germany are all closely integrated with and essentially extensions of, in some ways, of the U.S. military. So, not only do we vastly outspend them already, but our militaries are combined with regional powers all over the world, particularly in Europe and Asia. And so, when you add all that up, you realize, oh my goodness, this is just next level ridiculous. And further, it's not just that we're in these alliances, but we also have troops not everywhere, of course, that would be an exaggeration, but goodness, we have a lot of military stations, hundreds of thousands of troops overseas. We have more troops stationed overseas than most countries have in their militaries. But we have major troops. It depends on what you count major troops, but we have thousands of troops in more than 30 countries, and we have a significant military presence and closing in on 100 countries around the world. And we have soldiers in more countries than that, but then we're getting to pretty small units. So, significant military presence in every region of the world, which again is historically anomalous. So we are one of the first, if not the first, truly global military powers. Again, if you even look at the British Empire, they had very few military personnel stationed most places in the world. The way they projected power was with their navy, through trade, and through local forces. And it's not that we don't do all that, we do, but we also have this sort of overwhelming military presence in many places in the world. So you add all this up, and it's, again, wow, this is sort of a combination of economic, military, political, cultural heft that is truly just astonishing. And again, unprecedented. But again, I don't think this is news. But what I do think makes it important is that it's very little understood of what makes American culture go, where it comes from, how it developed, and hence how it projects on the world and how American culture tends to see the world. And of course, this is a very challenging thing, but you would think, given the sheer scale of U.S. cultural influence, that this would be more closely and clearly articulated. But I became increasingly frustrated when I just really didn't feel it had been well expressed and studied, or at least in places that I could find. And so, hence launching this series. In part, hence moving to France to begin to reframe my mind and get a better understanding of U.S. society from the outside. And by the way, I think this may be one of the reasons that it's not as well understood, and that the works I did tend to find that I found more satisfying, that I'll be referring to in the coming episodes, were by either Americans who had left or by foreigners who had moved to the United States, because it takes almost a double vision to be able to see what's happening with enough clarity to be able to articulate this. So, in sum, the U.S., hugely important and influential, and I would argue, but the cultural implications of this, how it developed, where it came from, and what it stands for, very little understood. So, where did this all come from? So, again, episode 1, America may have come to exist in 1989. Probably not earlier than that. Again, a bit of an exaggerated claim, but I think you'll see what I'm talking about. So how can I say the U.S. did not exist until 1989? Well, if you think about what makes a country traditionally, as we think about it, so you can take even a country like, say, Germany, which did not really become a state, nation state per se, until very recently, just over 100 years ago. And but you can go, oh, well, they're a new country, and yes, they are a new country, but culturally, and the cultural habits and patterns and sociological history of Germany, the language, the patterns of living, the geography of their cities, all of those things, there was a core of, German-speaking countries and areas that had been more or less stable for hundreds of years. In fact, for a very long time indeed. And so when it was formally organized into a nation state, and by this way, this is one of the things that nation states were doing when you get rolling and whenever you want to say this happened, 17th and 18th century, certainly 19th century sort of brings it all and puts a bow on it. It was this agglomeration of old order that kind of fades away, and this new, geographically defined areas with, somewhat similar religious, cultural outlook, often linguistically organized with one or two or three major languages that were related to each other or had a long history of living next to each other. And so these would become, attempt to become nation states. And that transition means that, yes, while Germany was recognized late, it had been, this cultural core was there. This is not the case with the United States. And everything that follows, is important to remember that Native Americans don't count very specifically. You have to ignore the Native Americans for America to work. And so I think the next episode 2 or 3, will address this very directly. But I do want to say at the front that these numbers do not count Native Americans, because you have to not count them to make the American experiment function. And we'll see why later. But so America in 1770, so this is just before the Revolutionary War, which kicks off 1776, had about 2 million people, again, not counting Native Americans, and was about 410,000 square miles. So pretty good size, bigger than France, but, with about 2 million people. And France at this time, by the way, had about 30 million people. So 1800, 30 years later, the population is 5.4 million, and the territory is 864,000 square miles. So after the revolution, more territory is added, frontiers are pushed back, and so the country has both more than doubled in size and more than doubled in population in 30 years. And so this is a pattern that will repeat, is going, okay, if your country just became twice the size and has twice as many people in 30 years, what's its core? What's its tradition? What's its foundations? Like this is going to be a repeated problem. Then if you jump forward 60 years to 1860, because this is just before the American Civil War, a very big, important event, which we'll talk about later, now you have 31 million people. So it's 6 times the population, and it's 2.9 million square miles now, because Louisiana Purchase, et cetera, new territories out west. And so the square mileage has gone up by 4 times, and the population has gone up by 6 times. So again, I mean, so just 30 or 40 years ago, that territory was not part of your country. And there's nobody who counts, Native Americans there, but nobody who counts was there. And now there's tens of millions of people around, more people around, and they're in places where they never were before. So there's no history, no traditions, no patterns that pre-exist their arrival there, because again, Native Americans don't count. 1920, now you're 105 million people. So again, 4 times the population increase in 60 years. And you have 3 million square miles. So France in this time has stayed roughly the same size and added 50% population. The United States has grown by 8 times and has seen its population increase by 50 times. So 8 times the territory, 50 times the population. And so the notion of historical or geographic continuity or social patterns simply makes no sense. It doesn't exist. Like they don't, when you're changing, growing this rapidly and having this many new people, you just, you don't have time to lay down patterns. Because there was nobody there, and then there was a few people there, and then there were a million people there. And so this scale and speed of change is just astonishing. So again, to give some more numbers here, in California in 1860, which just becoming states now, there was about 350,000 people, and in Texas there was about 600,000. In 1920, so 60 years later, California has 3.5 million people, so 10 times the population. Texas has 4.7 million people, so 8 times the population-ish. And 1960, so 40 years later, getting more contemporary, California has 15.5 million people. So again, a 5-fold increase again. So a 10-fold increase, then a 5-fold increase. And similarly with Texas, 4.7 to 9.5 million. So almost exactly doubling. And so even though the territory size of the United States stabilized, states like California and Texas are seeing such rapid population growth that literally over the course of 20 years, if you stayed in one place in California or Texas, you were likely to be surrounded by 90% of the population around you being new people. Because that is the rate at which the population is increasing. And California and Texas are not anomalous, by the way. I'll talk about this from regional variation, but just to give you even more shocking numbers, I mean, these are almost unbelievable. So Michigan and Minnesota. So Michigan becomes a state in the 1830s, 1837, let's say. Again, feel free to check these numbers. 1837, I think, is right with Michigan, and Minnesota is like 1850s, late 1850s. I forget exactly when. So early on, say 1830 in Michigan, right before it becomes a state, there's about 31,000 people. In 1850, so 20 years later, there's about 391,000 people. So that's a 10-fold increase in 20 years. 20 years later, there's 1.1 million people. So that's a 4-fold increase. So think about that. So you went from a tenfold increase in 20 years, and then you quadrupled that in 20 years. So again, even if you were born and raised in Michigan, imagine the changes you're going to see. There's just massive influx of people that are surrounding you, new people, strangers, foreigners. And then from 1870 to 1900, went from 1.1 to 2.4 million, so doubled again, a little more slowly, but still massive. And then from 1900 to 1930, doubled again. So this is, tenfold, fourfold, double. This is just unbelievable growth, all within 100 years. And again, to put it in context, France in 200 years only increased by 50%. Whereas, these states this is like parabolic growth. Minnesota followed a similar path. Just before it becomes a state, it has about 6,000 people. In 1850, in 1870, it has 780,000 people. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And then in 1900, it has 1.75 million people. So in 50 years, it doesn't make sense to even calculate that. It just grew astronomically. And then from 1900 to 1930, it added another 750,000 people. So in 80 years, it went from essentially no one, 6,000 to 10,000 people, to 2.5 million people. And so you have, on one hand, you have these states like this, the North, the Midwest, and the West, which had no long-term settlements. Well, no long-term settlements that count, of course, because Native Americans don't count, and the Spanish and Native Americans in the Southwest, they don't count. So of quote-unquote Americans, they don't exist. And so you just have millions and millions of new people arriving in a new place with no existing patterns of life. This is to be distinct, that you should make a distinction here from places in the East Coast and the South, which had more stable population growth. They had population growth, rapid population growth, but nothing like these areas. And so if you look for tradition and history and people that have more cultural coherence, it tends to be in the South and in places in the East Coast. However, notice that this creates not more coherence within the country, but more dislocation in the country. Because what does someone living in Texas in 1880 have to do with someone living in New York City in 1880? I mentioned this before, and why I wanted to start talking about Cormac McCarthy and said this was kind of a preamble, is Cormac McCarthy sets his novels at roughly the same time Henry James sets his novels in America, except Henry James is writing contemporaneously, more or less. And Cormac McCarthy is writing, quote unquote, basically historically, setting some of his novels in the past. But they have nothing to do with each other. I mean, they're just totally remote in every way, but in part because Cormac McCarthy is not, his America is the America of, Texas and the Southwest and the deserts and all this. And James is interested in New York, New Hampshire and Europe. And so these are just totally different worlds, even though theoretically they are sharing the same country and same civilization. Functionally, they just aren't. So at the same time, you have this just unbelievably massive growth all over the United States, both in territory and in population. You have massive migration, particularly between 1880 and 1930. To the point where at one point, about 15%, around 1900, around 15% of the U.S. population was foreign-born, and about 23 million immigrants came to the United States in those 50 years. Now, of course, immigration had always been happening, but it really accelerated during this time period. And so, again, not only do you have whole new areas and territories being settled, so it didn't matter where these people came from, they were going to be strangers. But you also have this influx of a significant percentage, 10 to 15% of the total population, creating these pockets of very foreigners. So it's like this double foreignness. So if you move from, say, Italy to escape poverty or rural Italy to New York, okay, you're a foreigner. And New York is going to be very different to you. But if you then move, which many of them did, to say Minnesota, I mean, now you're just you're on the moon, right? This Minnesota has no association with you. You have no association with it. Maybe another family member had moved there, so you form a small Italian colony, but it's just, this is just not working, right? This is not functionally bringing Italy over from the old world to the new world. At the same time that you have these other big immigrations and mass migrations internally happening, you also had from 1910 to 1940, one of the first two great African-American diasporas, when about 1.6 million, which is give or take, 2% of the U.S. population at the time, something like that, 1 to 2%, moving from the south to the north. And so cities like Chicago see massive influxes of African-Americans that really helped build the city and establish it. As the industrialization is taking place and shipping centers are picking up steams and African Americans want to escape southern poverty and sort of racism and other sorts of problems that they were experiencing, and so you got this massive diaspora. And so this is the context within American cultural history right up until say World War II. Just hold that date in mind because this is hugely important in American history. And so what this means is, right up until World War II, most of the country was filled mostly with people who were strangers. So there was no, in 1950, California had been around for theoretically about 100 years. But the population 100 years earlier was 1/50th or 1/80th of what it was today. So it had no association with what had been there before. It was growth and change and transformation at a speed and a scale that was just unbelievable. I mean, they call them boom towns. All these places that would spring up and be built and just grow by the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands year after year after year. And so you're going, okay, you're a stranger in a strange land, as to use a famous phrase. And so what does this mean for cultural patterns and associations and knowledge? So you've left your old world. And again, one of the main things about all this new territory is this is land. And one of the key structuring elements of almost all of Europe and a lot of Asia, we also have Asian immigrants on the West Coast, Japan and China, although that was curbed quite forcefully right after the turn of the century, land was divided up. Land use was heavily regulated. If there was anything that limited your opportunities and freedoms, one of them was the land poverty, land scarcity. And different countries have had different ways of trying to address this. But basically, if you were born poor and born without land, the chance of acquiring it were relatively small until industrialization really picks up. But then you get all the problems with modern industrialization, which we'll talk about in again a later episode. And so you decide, hey, I heard there's this land of opportunity, literally land of opportunity, where I can go and I can, experience the opportunity to maybe own my own land. I can go and make a new future for myself. And so people come, and to the extent that that's true, which it was largely true comparative to the old world, this makes the new world completely unlike the old world. So your old patterns of living, your communal identifications, the restrictions, all of these things that you grew up with and might have known just don't translate. So you can, if you move from like a rural Italian village to a rural French village, in a lot of ways it's going to be very different. But in a lot of ways it's going to be very similar, because you're probably going to have land tenure issues. They may be different, but they're going to be the same things. They're going to be large landowners. Most people aren't going to have that much access, so on and so forth, right? When you move to a country where there's just so many different geographic regions, so that you have, deserts, high plains, the Midwest. I mean, you just have woods, mountains, mining. You have all different opportunities in that sense. Also, it's not all pre-claimed. there's a reason many of the founding fathers, which we'll talk about again in a future episode, were land speculators, right? It was not a coincidence that they happened to be the people who were also hugely important in the founding of the country. And so this destruction of the patterns of the old world, not purposefully, it's just that they did not apply. There was really, really difficult to bring them over. And so you have to come up with a new way of building culture, a new way of building society. And what they came up with and what they called this was they called it the melting pot or assimilation, which is this idea that's developed later to kind of retroactively explain this. And having been raised in the United States and educated there, this was the explanation that was given to the extent that it was given. It was like, oh yeah, we're going to assimilate to American values. We're going to have a melting pot of American culture. And that's what makes us great. We take all these different people from all these different places, and we all become one because we have this shared assimilation, melting pot experience, and yay, go America, rah, rah, rah. Okay, great. Well, what do we assimilate to? And this is the key. This is a point I can't emphasize enough. To understand the United States, American outlook, American patterns of living, American psychosis, if you want to call it that, is to understand that there was nothing to assimilate to. The secret to assimilating America is to have nothing to assimilate to. And the example that I came up with, which may be crazy, I'll admit this, but it resonated as true to me, is that in early societies, tribal societies, they do these ceremonies. I think it's almost everything I've ever read or seen. It seems ubiquitous, is where they dress up with masks or costumes or makeup, and the leaders or the shamans embody and act out or dance out and sing out or recite poetry of the deities or heroes, the mythopoetic figures of their cultures. And they embody them. They bring them to life with the masks and the costumes and the dancing and the chanting and these extraordinary embodiments. In the United States, we did exactly the opposite. The reason you need masks and costumes and painting is because everybody knows you. So the shaman or the leaders or the people, whoever was going to do the embodiment, you don them and just, so, the narrative takes off. We do not recognize you anymore. We see the mask. We see this new person, because in primitive societies, in tribal societies, you don't have strangers are very rare. That's an anomalous thing. Most of the people you see, most being 90% of the people you see almost all the time, you've always known. And so for someone to become other, they put on the mask. Oh, I don't know Bob anymore. I don't know Sally anymore. Now they are the king. They are the embodied warrior from the past. They are the great queen of healing, right? They are the goddess. They are the god, right? Something magic has happened, and we can have this. And then when they take the mask off after the ceremony is over, now it's Jeff again, right? Okay, you're back to being who I've always known for my whole life, because you've always been there. The U.S., it sort of works the opposite way around. Because we don't know anybody, and because we're in a land of strangers, and we're moving around, and we're in a land where we don't have a lot of pre-existing patterns, we have to establish them ourselves, and we need to communicate them clearly to everybody. So we need to put on masks and costumes and behaviors and attitudes that communicate who we are, because otherwise nobody knows who we are, because we haven't all been raised together. Again, when you think about, in Michigan, when you go from 31,000 people to 1.1 million people in 40 years, this means that 90% of the people around you or more are just going to be strangers. Plus, almost certainly your history in the place, even if you were born there, only goes back a single generation. So this extraordinary recency of everything means you don't have patterns, you don't have associations, you're surrounded by strangers. And so how do you let people know who you are? How do you know who other people are, you act, you don the mask, the clothes, the identifiers of someone who is assimilated. You behave as if you know what it means to be an American, and you never ask what it is to be an American, because that's the not asking what it means to be an American, I think, is the definitive feature of being an American. Because if you ask, if you look in there, what you find out is, oh no, like, wow, there's sort of there's a hole there. We don't know. Like, it can't. There's so much that it can't be. That is terrifying. Now, it's not that there isn't anything there, which I'll talk about more, but I think the overwhelming power of it is this lack of any kind of clear, definitional, identifiable anything. And so, famously in the United States, for a country of so many immigrants that speak so many languages, you would almost never know it. English. In the last couple of maybe decades, Spanish has like come on a little bit, but even that is controversial. But, you know, we have a huge Spanish-speaking community and population, huge being like, I forget, 20 to 30 million. It's a lot. But we act as if that is not there, because we know that, well, English is the American language. And so that's just assume. We're not going to say people can't speak those languages or that they shouldn't speak those languages. We're just going to assume that the act of pretending like English is the only language is a key part of being American, right? That's this is what makes it. It's not that those languages don't exist. It's just if we pretend they don't, even though we know they do, then that helps somehow. And so it's this continual repeated process of assimilation through vacuum, so that when you take off the mask and when you take off the dress that you put on to embody the American, what you find is there's nothing there. There's this great core that is hollow. And I don't mean this as a criticism. It's just, again, this is why I started with so many statistics on how new, recent, unformed, unshaped, unpatterned the cultural experience of the United States has been. Because, and by the way, continues to be in a large part. So where I taught in Washington State, a very new state, of course, I would ask in my college classes every year, and as part of another class, because I always found this interesting, how many students had been born, those college students had been born in Port Townsend. And usually there were 3 or 4. Not usually a lot more than that. So if we have 25 students, let's say 5, I'll just be generous and say 5 of them were born and raised in Port Townsend. So that means 20 of them were not. And then I would say, okay, of those 5 students, how many of you had parents who were born in Port Townsend? And about every other year, I would have one student who had one parent who was born in Port Townsend. And this was a residence college. This was a local college. This wasn't a college that people came from other places to go to. This was definitely a community college for local students. And so I'm sitting there in a classroom going, okay, so 80% of you came here after you were born, and 98% of you, whatever that number works out to be, even if you were born here, do not have a parent who was born here. And occasionally you get one person who has had one parent who was born here. So at most, you could be second generation, right? So while not officially immigrants in the sense of, first generation coming over from the Netherlands or from China, it's, you're not even first generation. You were 12 when you came over from Ohio or California or New York. And so, and this is true not just in Washington, this is true all over in many parts of the country, where you get these massive mixings of people. And so what is the pattern? The pattern is the lack of pattern. The pattern is the acceptance of this notion that it's all working and everything is groovy. And so this is not, like I said, this is not criticism of the American state of mind or outlook. It is simply a byproduct of the kind of rapid expansions, both territorial and demographic, that is so complex and so new and so short-lived that how else could you do it in a world of strangers? How else, what else would you be? Where would you get your pattern? Where would you get your ideas? Where would you get your stability or sense of self and identity? It's just where. And again, so it is this vacuum in the middle that shapes so much of the American identity. And I say that this probably lasts up until so World War I becomes hugely important. I'll talk about that in a later episode, because at the end of World War II, at the end of World War II, America finally got the desperately needed identity, which was, we're not communists. And so there was this great run, which many people look back on with, a sense of loss. They're like, oh, it was so great. These were the golden years. This was the golden age. People have all this nostalgia for the 50s and 60s, and to a certain extent the 70s. And in part, I think this is because, people always look nostalgically to the past, but I think in the American case, it is because finally, for about 30 or 40 years, we knew who we were because we were not communists. This is the key. That's a lot. Okay, great. We're not communists. Why do we do things? Because we're not communists. Well, is this worth investing in? Well, the communists don't do it, so we're going to do it. Who are we fighting? We're fighting the bad guys. We're the good guys. The communists are the bad guys. Yay. We've got our identity. We know who we are. Everything is clear. We have a narrative, and we love it. And so this was very shaping. And you have all these narrative, all kinds of political movements. You have communist witch trials. You have the whole, cultural panoply all around communism bad. We're not communists, therefore we're good, and we know what we're doing. Well, when the wall comes down, this is a problem, because now, who are you? Right? Well, we're not the communists, but the communists aren't really around anymore. So not being something that doesn't exist is not as fulfilling and organizing it as it used to be. And other commentators besides myself have noted quite powerfully, and some presciently, who they talked about this as soon as the wall came down. They said, hey, one of the things that's going to happen is the United States' cultural narratives are going to dissolve, and it's going to get ugly. And I think this is part of the reason the political and cultural nature of the U.S. society over the last 30 years has gotten so vexed and so confusing and seems so out of whack, is because this core defining element of our identity, which was negative, not the communists, was taken away and exposed this underlying tension in American society, which is we just have no clear idea of who we are, why we exist, what we're doing, and why. And if that point can be grasped, I think so much else that seems bizarre and mystifying about American society, maybe maddening, maybe charming, depending, will come into focus. And so for this first lecture, I just really wanted to emphasize this, the degree to which the pattern of the founding and development of the U.S. physical continent shaped to a significant degree the outlook, and necessarily the outlook, of American cultural forms and people, because it robbed people of any sense of social coherence and stability and pattern that most societies from most of world history have just taken for granted. And into that void, really not much was poured. And so at core, there is this great longing for, desperation for, a sense of identity in many American individuals, groups, cultural movements. It's one reason that so many cults take off in America, pyramid schemes, so many things that give people a sense of identity are taken advantage of and exploited because it makes you very exploitable. And we'll see lots of examples of this as we move forward. But if you just think of just unending love in American society for millennialism, oh, the world's about to end, all these cults form around that, doomsday saying, all sorts of various forms of really bizarre fundamentalism that's been around. Well, if you have this massive void to fill, the opportunities for people to exploit that are just almost endless, and it's almost endlessly exploited. And so again, that's just one example. We'll look at many more as we go forward. But one of the notable and most important founding elements of American social outlook is precisely this lack of a sense of identity, coherence, and history. And it drives, again, the American obsession with, oh, where are you from? Where are your roots from? Oh, I'm Irish. What they mean is they can track back to some Irish relative they had 4 generations ago. So they're 197% Irish. And so, but that's enough, because anything, you'd still buy any straw, you grab any branch in a storm, right? Any log floating down a river when you're drowning looks like a good one. And so the constant desperation to reach out and say, oh, I'm like this, oh, I'm like this, oh, this is my heritage, oh, this is my culture. And it's never pinned on, or rarely pinned on, anything that is American. Now, again, this is somewhat divergent. The South, more stable in some ways and unstable in some ways, because its growth patterns were different. Some areas of the East Coast that are older, and that you had people who did stay in some areas a little longer. And so you do have anomalous regions and areas where there is a little more of this. But by and large, 90% of the time, 90% of the culture, and more than 90%, of course, by population figures, are essentially still without any clear historical or cultural moorings, as most of the rest of the world would understand that concept of having a place where your society had a pattern that you had imbibed, and that your relatives had probably lived something similarly for a generation or two, and that change took place at a pace that you could assimilate, even if it was like industrialization, which was a massive disorientation for a lot of people. It took a significant number of years to take place. So all those kinds of forms that in most of the world, not all of the world, but in much of the world, are taken for granted, just did not exist in the United States. And that was the functional defining element, was the destruction of old forms without the production of specific new forms. That's the combination that makes it bizarre, and that drives so much of what we'll talk about. So I'll wrap up there. Sorry for all of the numbers that I threw at you so quickly, but again, it's just the dramatic, massive change and expansion of the U.S. over such a short period of time that drives everything that or a lot of what we want to understand as forming the American cultural outlook. So if you have questions about this, please put them below the video or email me. I'll put my website up there. I'll just put my email address up. I guess that's the easiest way. And then I look forward to your questions. And in part 2, we're going to look at the notion of self-reliance and libertarianism. Thank you very much.